Before we kick off, here are a few important details to ensure a smooth experience. We have a very full agenda, as you can see on the slide. We will start with presentations from our speakers. This will be followed by a panel discussion and a Q&A session. Please feel free to use the Q&A session to pose your questions. We will be answering the questions during the Q&A session at the end. Event is being recorded and will be shared on our website after the event, as will the slides from the presenters. Finally, your feedback is valuable to us. Following the webinar, you'll receive a short survey. We appreciate your time to share your thoughts and your suggestions. Without further ado, let me call upon our speaker for a keynote address. Dr. Michael Akinwumi is Chief Responsible AI Officer at National Fair Housing Alliance. Over to you, Michael.
Thank you, Jamil. Good time of the day to everyone. I want to extend my heartfelt gratitude to all of you for joining today's webinar. And special appreciation goes to the webinar planning team, the logistics team for their flawless execution, and our excellent speakers, which we've lined up, as well as our host for today's important discussion. I must also express our profound gratitude to the Wells Fargo Foundation for their financial support, CoreLogic for their invaluable data contribution, and the dedicated team at FairPlay AI for their collaboration in this important and strategic research. Additionally, a significant acknowledgement is due to our fearless leader, Lisa Rice, whose visionary approach has strategically positioned the National Fair Housing Alliance at the forefront of AI in housing and lending, for recognizing that indeed AI is the new civil and human rights frontier. The recent release of the 2024 Stanford University's Human-Centered AI Index report sheds light on a critical issue which we are going to discuss here today. Despite the growing pervasiveness of AI, only 20% of North American organizations recognize the importance of fairness in AI systems. Again, only 1 out of every 5 North American organizations either developing or using AI recognizes the importance of fairness in AI systems. This is particularly concerning given the deep-seated legacy of discrimination in housing, from racial covenants, racial zoning, and redlining, blockbusting steering, to appraisal bias. All these continue to widen the racial home ownership gap, surpassing the disparities present at the time of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. Lack of guidance from regulators or policymakers is a possible explanation for this unacceptable lack of incentive to search for least discriminatory AI models in mortgage underwriting. Our collaborative study with FairPlay AI offers a promising solution to addressing some of the issues related to the widening racial home ownership gap. Through a technique known as distribution matching, which you're going to learn more from FairPlay AI and other panels later today, we've demonstrated that it is feasible to adjust AI-based mortgage underwriting systems to ensure the outcome distributions for protected groups like Black or Hispanic applicants closely match those of control groups, such as white applicants, effectively reducing or eliminating disparate impact risk. This method not only enhances fairness, but also maintains the accuracy and profitability of the underwriting models. This preliminary finding challenges the often cited accuracy-fairness trade-off used to justify resistance against developing less discriminatory models in mortgage underwriting, which as expected by regulators. The finding shows a path forward where we can diminish lending biases and broaden fair housing opportunities, particularly for Black and Hispanic communities, thereby helping to narrow the home ownership gap. To implement this technique widely, significant legal and policy reforms are necessary. The recent White House executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI urges housing and finance regulators to employ every available tool, including AI techniques, to ensure AI models in housing and lending are held to the highest standards of fairness. Regulators need to provide clear guidance on pursuing less discriminatory models and possibly making privacy exceptions like the provisions in the EU AI Act to allow developers access to the data needed for proactive discrimination testing. I encourage everyone here today to engage deeply with the discussions about this distribution matching technique and the necessary legal and policy shifts required to advance the dividends of our study to the marginalized and the underserved. Your participation is crucial in tearing down the barriers to improving fairness of automated mortgage underwriting processes, ultimately delivering equitable treatment to all mortgage applicants. Thank you for your attention, and now I will hand over the floor to Jamil.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks for that introduction and valuable insights. I will now pass it over to Lucine Petrosan, who is AI policy researcher at National Fair Housing Alliance, about AI in housing. Over to you, Lucine.
Great. Thanks, Jamil. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Hopefully you can see my slides without any issues. Really excited to have you all here joining us, what promises to be an intriguing and timely discussion. We'll be diving into today for the pressing matter of addressing AI bias in mortgage lending to ensure fairness and equitable access to housing. But before doing so, let's first establish and set the scene before we get to our joint research findings and panelist insights in how AI in general is affecting fair housing, particularly as it relates to fairness and discriminatory outcomes. So what is algorithmic bias, if we can establish some simple definitions around this? Generally, algorithmic bias refers to data-driven or systemic errors that do lead to disproportionate outcomes, such as favoring one category over the other. Algorithmic bias can be harmful and discriminatory, either directly through disparate treatment or indirectly through disparate impact, disadvantaging certain groups of people based on characteristics over protected attributes. AI bias can emerge from both technical and non-technical decisions when it comes to developing the systems, whether it's unrepresentative or historical data sets, which at this point are unavoidable, model choices architecturally, or choosing the variables that we give influence to, as well as lack of responsible AI protocols, such as fairness measures and testing for bias. In terms of the impact of AI bias on civil rights and human rights, it has some core implications specifically on fairness, equality, as well as justice. At the first level here at the chart, you can see typical components of AI solutions will incorporate some form of identifying what the problem is, making design choices for a proposed system, gathering the underlying data, as well as everything we require for our model development and training, developing the model, and then making sure that it's fit for the deployment state that we're trying to implement it into to interact with the new data sets. At the second level here, I'm just exemplifying some of the solutions that can emerge from these AI models. So predictive solutions such as tenant screening, generative solutions such as leasing AI chatbot, or descriptive solutions providing housing trends insights, as well as diagnostic solutions such as using facial recognition or Face ID. All of these tools are embedded in our social structures, and they do impact employment, who gets access to employment, to housing, to criminal justice reform, to education, access to general credit and financial resources, healthcare, privacy, and freedom of expression. So as you can see, AI or socio-technical systems, they're not existing in silos. Therefore, they must strive to not just be accurate, but also prioritize fairness in their design to combat these potential adverse impacts that we've seen over time. More specifically for housing, NAFA's core mission is quite simple and governed by this notion that where you do live matters. With today's discussion, we also want to echo why fair housing movement is absolutely fundamental and intertwined with other core human and civil rights issues. Housing is not just a means of shelter, but it's often deterministic of how we position our lives to nurture our lives and our stories. And fair and quality access to housing is essential for overall well-being and unlocking the prosperities of our individuals as well as communities. So when we think about AI bias specifically in the housing context, from renting to buying to selling a home, digitization has really transformed all aspects of housing-related transactions. Over the years, we have seen these notable core areas of use cases. In housing search, for the case of advertisements, algorithms can be used to be exclusionary. You may note of NAFA suing Facebook a couple years ago for this example, where it enabled brokers and landlords to exclude specific people from their target housing advertisements. In mortgage lending, for the focus of majority of our discussion today, AI can implement to be discriminatory towards certain groups based on the historical disparities that are embedded in our data sets that reflect on our outcomes from these tools. The most recent case of this is CNN's investigation of the Navy Federal denying more than half of the qualified Black applicants that were more than qualified for conventional mortgage loans. In the case of automated valuation models, which are essentially estimating a value of a home when you're trying to sell your home, AI utilizing historically biased data sets can perform less accurately on specific homes, and research has shown this to disproportionately impact Black areas or Black homeowners. In the case of tenant screening, automated systems are being used to screen who has access to having fundamental access to housing. In this case, the data sets that are utilizing sometimes criminal records, credit histories, again, could perpetuate historical biases, disproportionately impacting marginalized groups. There are a number of lawsuits ongoing in this particular case. The most recent one is the lawsuit against Safe Rent for discriminating against Black and Hispanic rental applicants for not considering the benefits of using a housing voucher. Outside of those core areas, we're also seeing emerging issues related to AI use in housing. We're witnessing the rise of dynamic pricing and how it's changing housing costs, whether it's rent or cost of purchase. These are determining and adapting in real time to adhere to market demands, and does offer flexibility, but also raises concerns of fairness and accessibility for the prospects who are interested. I have cited here a recent case that's ongoing of Duffy and Yardy, where Yardy is accused of using a software illegally to inflate prices, as well as potentially using sensitive data. Facial recognition software, we have witnessed over time that it has very well established high risks in practice, particularly impacting disproportionately the accuracy rates amongst people of color, and they are being deployed in housing contexts. The recent case on this was Washington Post investigation of how it's being deployed in public housing spaces as a mechanism of surveillance. Risk scoring and price systems are also showing evidence of disparate impact, leading to disparities in credit and insurance platforms. The recent example of Husky was just State Farm was alleging that State Farm is using AI in their claims processing disproportionately, again, impacting Black policyholders, flagging their claims with greater scrutiny, causing more turnover time, and just unfair treatment in general. We also are aware of the limited and already established risks that there are associated with computer vision technologies, given their underlying data sets. It raises concerns of how these emerging visual tools for inspections in real estate, as well as photography tools, are going to potentially have biased outcomes. And a last case we have highlighted here, there's many, but it's the emergence of large language models. So AI chatbot leasing agents, again, the underlying data sets, if they're not tested for disparate impact or treatment for specific categories, they can display unfair treatment. And the most recent case we've highlighted here is Open Communities having settlement recently with Harbor Group for their use of AI chatbot that was automatically rejecting applicants using housing vouchers. So these are just quick snapshots of the real world implications of AI bias in housing. So when we think about AI governance and oversight, we have established over time that existing laws do apply, right? From the regulators, this is also the narrative. We have the Fair Housing Act, we have the Fair Credit Opportunity Act, the Fair Credit Reporting Act, specifically for tenants, restricting the type of information that landlords can use and so on. So there are existing laws, as well as state and local laws are taking up to their jurisdictions to be more proactive about having restrictions on this technology. But the issue is truly in the lack of transparency to enforce these laws. So there is a greater need for having more visibility into how these systems are designed, what protocols they're taking for adhering to responsible AI principles, and how are they doing that post-deployment as well to be on ongoing governance and oversight protocols. So there is a clear need for greater transparency to ensure that accountability and enable that effective law enforcement that we are lacking currently, and make sure that we're all upholding the due process. So beyond the regulatory compliance, we need to counter the emergence of digitized injustices before they become a catalyst for change. The promise of responsible AI in practice is to proactively avoid the harms of unethical practices of these tools and discriminatory policies, and not just wait for these cases to actually impact real lives and then to be proactive about it. So in terms of what that looks like in general for housing, we advocate for AI in housing to be non-discriminatory, privacy enhancing, reliable, so that counts for both safety and accuracy amongst all groups of people, transparency in terms of what goes into the model, and as well as when it's applied, we have awareness of how these tools are being applied, as well as controllability. So these are some of the general protocols of responsible AI that we like to think of when we think of in practice for housing. In the context of AI-powered underwriting, the focus of today's session, disparate impact testing for fair lending usually does encompass these 3 stages. First, organizations have to adhere by regulation and look whether or not there is actually disparate impact against protected groups. And the second stage is moving on to evaluating whether or not the observed disparate impact is business justified, in order to go ahead with that baseline model. And the third is to have the active search for less discriminatory ways of achieving the same objective. So this is search for LDAs. LDAs in simplistic terms are just models that aim to achieve the same legitimate business objectives with the existing practices with reduced discriminatory impact. right? So it requires both searching proactively as well as making a decision how you're defining fairness and how you're going to incorporate that model to meet both your fairness and your business objectives. The common challenge is that largely we've just existed in this middle section, right? So if we do test for disparate impact, there's often a business justification that kind of allows for those models to go into place. But the common narratives around this is that there is limited availability of and scope of applicability for the LDAs, as well as fairness always comes at a cost of accuracy. It's making it difficult for businesses to balance fairness, define fairness, balance fairness with their business obligations as well, which are dependent on the accuracy. Today's research and today's discussion with the panelists is going to challenge both of those assumptions, as we know that advancements in machine learning research have enabled broader use cases and adoptions for LDAs, and accuracy and fairness can coexist. So we don't have to necessarily threaten the business objectives in any sense. So excited with that being said to conclude my presentation, hand it off to Jamil for us to kick off the discussion on this topic. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Lucine, to cover the different issues and concerns with AI in housing. Next, we will focus on the underwriting and pricing decisions and the proposed solution. We have a set of presenters from FairPlay AI, Kareem Saleh, who is the founder and CEO, and John Merrill, who's the co-founder and CTO. Over to you, John and Kareem.
Thanks, Jamil. Just gonna go ahead and share our screen here. Hopefully folks can all see this. Greetings from Venice Beach, California, folks. Kareem Saleh, founder and CEO of FairPlay, joined today by my co-founder, John Merrill, our CTO. We've had the good fortune of working with the National Fair Housing Alliance for a while now, engaged in a fairness optimization study of mortgage underwriting and pricing models with generous data support provided by CoreLogic. And we're excited to share with you the preliminary findings of that work today. A little by way of agenda, we will be talking about an algorithmic fairness technique today called distribution matching. So we're going to provide a little bit of context about what distribution matching is. We'll talk a little bit about the data that was provided for model building. We use that data to build fairness optimized linear and nonlinear models. So we use that data to build fairer models using kind of conventional modeling techniques and fairer models using more advanced machine learning techniques. We'll discuss the results, which I think have been previewed a little bit, but just to give you a sense of where we're going, we do find that distribution matching techniques can increase positive outcomes for Black and Hispanic applicants in particular, on the order of 5 to 13% at functionally equivalent rates of accuracy. And then we'll talk about some of the next steps that we plan to undertake in connection with the National Fair Housing Alliance, CoreLogic, and other partners. So let's dive in. We're going to describe kind of the key method by which this algorithmic fairness technique operates. And there's kind of two pieces to this that folks have to understand. One relates to something called loss functions, which is how predictive models learn to make accurate predictions. And then one relates to what's called distribution matching, which is how to get that learning process to be fair for all groups. So we're going to do a little bit of a kind of conceptual description of how predictive models are trained, and then how that training process has been augmented using distribution matching to try to make the overall outcomes of the training process fairer to historically underserved groups. So let's start by talking about what a loss function is. Typically, to train a predictive model requires a loss function. A loss function evaluates the quality of a model's learning and then informs improvements in its learning by measuring how far the model's prediction is from its objective. So, for example, let's take a step back. So every model must be given a target, and you can think of a target as kind of an objective it seeks to relentlessly maximize. So if you think about perhaps a social media algorithm, the target given to a social media algorithm is typically to keep the user engaged, right? So think about the Facebook algorithm. The Facebook is its target is to incent you, the user, to click. But if you think about it for a moment, you can see pretty quickly that giving a model one objective to relentlessly maximize can yield all kinds of undesirable or unforeseen consequences, right? So imagine for a moment that Tesla gave the neural networks that power its self-driving cars the mere target or the mere objective of getting a passenger from point A to point B. Well, the self-driving car might do that while driving the wrong way down a one-way street, or blowing through red lights, or causing mayhem to pedestrians. So what does Tesla have to do? Tesla has to give the neural network that powers its self-driving cars two targets, right? Get the passenger from point A to point B, while also respecting the rules of the road. And the good news is we can do this for all kinds of algorithms, including algorithms that are used in credit underwriting and in housing, right? So if you think about a traditional credit underwriting algorithm might be given the target of predicting who will default on a loan. We can give a credit underwriting algorithm an additional target, which is predict who's going to default on a loan, while also minimizing the differences in outcomes for a protected group. And so that's fundamentally what we have done here is we've modified a traditional loss function to include two objectives, kind of predict default risk accurately and minimize the differences in outcomes for one group relative to another. And by incorporating this secondary objective into the training process, we can produce models that optimize both for loan performance and for the equitable treatment of borrowers. And what's really cool about this is, as many folks on the call will know, express consideration of protected status is prohibited under the ECOA, under the Fair Housing Act, and under other non-discrimination and consumer protection laws. And so it would be illegal, for example, for us to use whether a person was Black or Hispanic or female as a direct input to a model. But to my knowledge, and I know there are some really expert folks on the call today, the law doesn't say anything about not being able to use some consciousness of the distributional properties of all groups in ways that allow you to build the model to be fair to everyone ab initio. And so that's what we have done here. We expose the loss function, exposes the model to the distribution of credit performance of all groups in ways that allow the model to be sensitive to populations that are not well represented in the data from the jump. And what that means is that at decision time, when it comes time to render an underwriting or a pricing or another high stakes decision about a consumer, that sensitive attribute, that protected status information is not required. So we believe that this is a way of making legitimate use of protected status information during the model building process, but not at decision time, in ways that allow the models to comply with various laws that prohibit discrimination and laws that prohibit the express consideration of sensitive attributes when making credit and other underwriting decisions. Let's talk about a little math. So fundamentally, what distribution matching does is try to minimize the differences in outcomes for one group relative to another. And if distribution seems like a fancy word, you can just think about like when I talk about distributions, I'm talking about like the patterns of outcomes for one group relative to another. So if you're looking at this figure on the right here that shows Black applicants and white applicants, if you imagine that the x-axis here are credit scores, you can see that the pattern of credit score outcomes for white applicants is justified to the right, and the pattern of credit score outcomes for Black applicants is justified to the left. And what distribution matching attempts to do is to get those two patterns of outcomes to be as similar as possible, while also maintaining that accuracy objective that we've been talking about, right? So we're trying to get the distributions of model outcomes to match as much as possible, but still account for the legitimate differences in risk that may exist for some individuals. And so fundamentally what we've done is treated differences in outcomes for one group relative to another as a form of model error that gets incorporated into the loss function. And so what you see here on the left side of the screen is kind of outcomes on the left side of the equal sign. Then you have an error reduction term. That is a standard error reduction term that is used in most loss functions, most functions that are trained that are tuned to predict default accurately. And then you can see on the right, we've included this additional term in the loss function, a disparity minimization term. So the model outcomes as represented on the far left should equal, right, accuracy, which is that error reduction term, plus fairness, that disparity minimization term. And by doing it this way, we've basically trained the model to learn that differences in outcomes for one group are a form of model error that should prompt retraining to both enhance accuracy while also minimizing disparities. Let's talk a little bit about the data that was provided for this study. So we were given a rather substantial data set by CoreLogic. The data set contained many millions of mortgage loans that were originated over a relatively long observation window. And each loan record that we were given by CoreLogic included information about the property itself, for example, the appraisal price of the property. It included information about the final loan terms. So for example, the APR on the mortgage or the loan to value ratio of the mortgage. And the data set also included a limited amount of information about each borrower, namely their FICO score at the time of origination and what's sometimes referred to as the back-end ratio of the loan. We conducted some data partitioning for purposes of readying the data set for modeling. And we wanted to make sure that we were using an observation window that was as representative of the current mortgage market as we could reasonably achieve. And we wanted to make sure that the loans that were considered as part of the study had enough time to quote unquote season, which is to say, that the loans had been originated with enough time to allow for defaults that sometimes happen in the out years of a mortgage. And so we selected loans that were originated between January of 2010 and December of 2014 to be used as an in-time training and testing set. We divided those loans into a 70-30 ratio. So 70% of those records were used for in-time training and 30% of those records were used for in-time testing. And then we reserved a year's worth of loans originated from January of 2015 through December of 2016 as an out-of-time testing set. So an in-time training set, in-time testing set, and an out-of-time testing set. This is considered kind of best practice with respect to that model validation, is to have an out-of-time test set. Very good. So we wanted to assess the ability of distribution matching to apply to both conventional modeling techniques and some of the more advanced machine learning techniques. And so we conducted fairness optimization both of a linear model, kind of a conventional underwriting methodology, and also of a nonlinear neural network, a much more advanced machine learning methodology. And as we've discussed a little bit, we have given each of those models targets. In the case of the underwriting model, the target was predict which applicants are likely to go 60 days past due on their mortgage, while also minimizing differences in outcomes for protected groups. And in the case of pricing models, we wanted to predict what the APR of the loan offered to the borrower would be, again, while minimizing disparities for protected groups. So delinquency and APR, for lack of a better data variable, both totally conventional underwriting and pricing targets used in financial services. And then what we've done is added to the target this disparity minimization term, this term that seeks to force the distributions of outcomes to be the same for one group relative to another. Let's look at the results. I recognize that these may be hard to parse, so I'll do my best here to make sense of these plots for you, aided by John, who sits here to my right. So I would direct your attention kind of to the two plots at the top for underwriting performance. You'll see there's a plot on the left for Black consumers, a plot on the right for Hispanic consumers. And let me walk you through this, the key here at the right, so you can see what's going on here. So light blue means that there are one or more constrained, in this case, constrained means fairness optimized. So one or more fairness optimized models, but no unconstrained models. That means there are some fairness optimized models, but no non-fairness optimized models within that performance range. Pink means that there are one or more non-fairness optimized or unconstrained models in that performance range. And purple means that there are both fairness optimized and non-fairness optimized models in the performance range. And what you see here is, in the case of underwriting performance for Black and Hispanic consumers, so those two plots kind of horizontally across the top of the slide, you see that you've got kind of a purple square. That is a range where you have both fairness optimized and non-fairness optimized models. And then directly above the purple square, you have several light blue squares. By the way, forgive me, I should have said at the top that the x-axis on these plots are accuracy as measured by AUC. And the y-axis here are fairness outcomes as measured in terms of adverse impact ratio. And what you see here is there are light blue boxes immediately on top of the purple boxes, which is to say there are fairer models at the equivalent rate of accuracy for both Black and Hispanic consumers on these plots. We see a very similar outcome when we look at this. By the way, was for neural networks. This was, fairness optimization of the more advanced machine learning techniques. And what we see here is very clearly a phenomenon that's sometimes referred to as model multiplicity, which is to say there are multiple models which achieve highly accurate outcomes for this predictive problem, which are also clearly fairer. We see a similar result with respect to fairness optimization of the logistic regression models, or the kind of more conventional modeling techniques. You see it very clearly in the Black chart. So you can see the light blue box directly above the purple box, right? So again, fairer models within the same accuracy performance range as the incumbent. It's a little tougher to discern in the case of the of the Hispanic consumers, but actually, if you look very closely, and I apologize for the size of these plots, it's hard to discern that there is actually an overlapping performance range between the light blue and the purple box in the Hispanic quadrant on the top right. And so what we observed was that whether it was either for the linear model or for the nonlinear model, you could achieve equivalent rates of accuracy all the way out to the second decimal place with rather substantial increases in fairness. In the case of the linear model, we see an increase of fairness of about 6.67%. And in the case of the nonlinear model, we see increases in fairness to Black consumers that are upwards of 13%.
Kareem, sorry to interject. We're a little over time.
Okay, I'll wrap it up very quickly. So these are the feature importances, the variable contributions for the constrained and unconstrained models. And what you can see here is there is very little difference in the variable contributions as between the constrained and unconstrained models. The key takeaway from that is that the fairness increase is achieved through just a minor perturbation of the variable weights, right? So FICO was responsible for 58% of the contribution in the non-fairness optimized model, whereas we've just diminished the reliance on FICO by, 7-8% in the fairness optimized model. So we've reduced the influence of FICO from 58% to about 51%. And we've tuned up the influence of these other variables, which are similarly predictive from a risk perspective, but have less of a disparity driving effect for Black and Hispanic applicants. We observe this same phenomenon with respect to the linear underwriting models. So the fairness increases that are achieved through fairness optimization of the linear models are achieved again through a minor perturbation of the existing variable set. Next steps. Well, there are some limitations to these findings that we hope to further ground as part of this research. One limitation of the data set that we were generously given, I might say, by CoreLogic, is that it lacked information about declined loans. It also lacked information about approved loans which were not taken, and it lacked a number of variables that are commonly available to mortgage lenders at the time of application. It also lacked certain information about the prevailing macroeconomic conditions at the time of application, such as the rate on the 10-year Treasury bill, which is quite important to setting mortgage pricing. So our intention and our recommendation is to repeat this study with an enhanced data set so that we can satisfy ourselves that these results would persist in the presence of some of these other variables. I know I'm over time. I'm sure we'll have a rich opportunity for discussion during the Q&A. So back over to the NAFA team for the next presenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Kareem. So from the technical framework now to the legal framework with our next presenter, who is Morgan Williams. He is General Counsel at NAFA. Over to you, Morgan.
Thanks, Jamil, and thanks everyone for joining us in this discussion today. As Jamil noted, we're going to pivot from this overview of distribution matching and an approach that may enhance fairness outcomes to the framework in which we need to be thinking about the significance of this kind of a breakthrough and what it means for our approaches to dealing with fairness in underwriting moving forward. Next slide, please. Broadly, when we're talking about the legal framework that we're going to be applying to analyze discrimination or bias in outcomes, we'll look to a couple of federal laws that have been in place for 50 years. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which ensures that there's not discrimination in the issuance or accessing of credit, and the Fair Housing Act, which precludes discrimination in housing or housing-related services. Next slide, please. The broad frameworks that these statutes outline preclude discrimination, but it's left it up to the courts to define how you prove discrimination. And the jurisprudence has established a couple of standards for, or theories of proof that are utilized in analyzing discrimination. One is regarded as disparate treatment, which is used in evaluating models to assess if there are particular protected classes such as race or gender or national origin or disability that are used directly as a variable in the model, or whether there are proxies, close proxies for those protected classes that may be used in the model. Another means of establishing disparate treatment in this context is if there are separate model approaches that are used between consumers of different protected classes. The second theory of proof that's detailed here is disparate impact. Disparate impact liability is established when there's a policy that has a disproportionate negative outcome for people of a protected classes. It doesn't require intent, and it doesn't require a policy that on its face is discriminatory. In fact, it can be applied to a model that works the same for all consumers. In fact, what disparate impact analysis involves is distinguishing and analyzing fairness in accuracy or model outcome from fairness in outcomes. Next slide, please. In applying the disparate impact theory, there is a three-step analysis, and the courts look at a kind of burden shifting approach such that in order to establish initial claim of discrimination under the disparate impact standard of liability, the plaintiff must assess the outcomes for the impacts of a policy or practice, or in this case, an underwriting model on a protected group. It's then the business entity or defendant that is responsible for assessing any legitimate business interests that necessitate or are driving this model's operation. And if there is a valid, legitimate business justification for a model or a policy that is being used in this context, then that can be a defense to disparate impact outcomes. However, and this is where the rubber meets the road, the third step of the analysis is if there is still a less discriminatory policy or practice that can be used to advance that business justification, then the policy that has the disparate impact would still be regarded as discriminatory. And it is this third mode of analysis in which we regard the analysis to assess less discriminatory alternatives, or as Lucine referenced, LDAs. Next slide, please. The presence of distribution matching poses an approach to underwriting that may manifest less disparities in outcome while still achieving accuracy in its predictive powers. As such, it represents a potential powerful, less discriminatory alternative, as do many of these emerging approaches that are being advanced in applying different tech-based approaches to underwriting and pricing. This calls on the industry to engage in compliance operations, to evaluate its underwriting approaches, and to institute approaches that may involve less discriminatory alternatives. There have been a number of proposals that have been issued around approaches to analyzing different models in credit underwriting. NAFA issued a broad framework in February of 2022, which instituted principles that were articulated more recently in the NIST AI risk management framework. The slide here references a FinReg Lab report that details a number of these approaches. And it concludes with reference to a fair lending monitorship of Upstart Network's lending model. And I want to reference, briefly the outcomes of that monitoring report that's detailed at the bottom of this slide. Upstart's an online lending marketplace that partners with banks to fund small business loans, car refinancing loans, and personal loans. In a long process over the last several years, it's undertaken monitoring to evaluate recommendations regarding the fair lending implications of its platform. And most recently, the monitor issued its fourth and final report. Notably, the report detailed an impasse that the parties reached over the standard of assessing whether a less discriminatory model would reasonably meet Upstart's legitimate business needs. This impasse shines a light on shortcomings in implementation of compliance approaches and the need for regulatory leadership. Next slide, please. In response to a 2021 request for information on regulation of AI bias involving federal regulators, the National Fair Housing Alliance led a broad coalition of partners in submitting a letter calling for federal agencies to issue robust policies that remind institutions of their legal obligations to test AI models for potential disparate treatment or disparate impact discrimination and the scope of associated regulatory oversight. It can be said that at this juncture, the agencies have been in learning mode for some time. This past January, Lisa Rice provided testimony on these issues to a federal congressional hearing. In her testimony, she called on several actions. First, all federal agencies with responsibility for supervision and enforcement of the Fair Housing Act, or ACOA, should emphasize that discrimination in AI models is illegal, including AI models developed or deployed by third parties. Brad will reference some recent guidance from the CFPB and others, but the remaining federal agencies should immediately issue similar announcements. Second, consistent with its existing authority, where a financial institution uses AI and there is indication of weakness in their compliance management systems, the agencies should use all of their tools to quickly address and prevent consumer harm. And finally, the agency should clarify acceptable models for AI testing so that institutions can align their methods accordingly. To further detail the policy implications of this breakthrough and related research, I'll turn it over to our colleague, Brad, or I guess Jamil, who may then facilitate us further. Thank you. Look forward to the discussion and the question and answer portion of the
Thank you, Morgan. Next, we'll hear from Brad Brawler, who is founder and principal at Inclusive Partners. Over to you, Brad.
All right, thank you. Let me just make sure I can get the screen here going. All right, there we go. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, I'm going to focus a bit on some of the policy implications related to AI, and particularly the search for less discriminatory alternatives. But first, I wanted to talk a little bit about why this is important. Not only, as the panel so far have been discussing, do we want to prevent discrimination and help implement more fair models in the use of AI. The backdrop here is that there's a huge homeownership gap, between different demographic groups in the United States. And as you can see here, this is a snapshot from just 2023 that was tabulated just last month in March. And you can see homeownership rates in the United States for whites around 70.4%, Hispanic for 49.5%, and Black 45.7%. So there's a 21 to 25% gap in homeownership rates, depending on whether you're white, Hispanic, or Black in the United States, because of perpetuated patterns of discrimination. And this is not something that's just unique to 2023. This is a very interesting graph that was put out by the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis also last month, which shows homeownership rates The purple line that you see at the top of the graph is for white homeowners, and then the other two bars that you can see are for Hispanic, the green, and purple, red, sorry, for the black. And you see huge differences here going back to 1994 and going forward. And I assume that, and I know for a fact that this gap has been in place as long as data has been maintained on this home ownership gap. So this isn't just something that's unique to 2023. So we keep this as a backdrop of things we are doing in the use of AI. Could it be a promising means of helping to reduce the racial wealth gap? The advocacy community has been really focusing on a variety of issues. And this is just to provide perspective of where AI fits in, not only addressing redlining, looking at appraisal bias. NAF has been very prominent in this role as well. But then I think where we're focused today is really the push for robust disparate impact analysis of complex models and AI, including the search for LDAs. And I should also mention another key component in the advocacy community on the policy perspective is support for special purpose credit programs. And the regulatory community has been great on this and has been uniformly supportive of that these special purpose credit programs meet both the Fair Housing Act and the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So why is this important? Well, as previous panels have discussed, advocates on the policy front have been really advocating for the responsible use of AI and data in use of AI and machine learning models, monitoring for disparate impact. But, and I know people from the CFPB are on this call as well, great fans of the CFPB and the staff there. But as you're starting to hear a recurring theme of the advocacy community thinks that there could, and industry thinks that there could be a little bit more guidance here offered by the CFPB in terms of effective methods and approaches and metrics that lenders should consider when they're, and housing lenders, when they're using AI. And one of the key moments for the Biden administration was back in October of 2023, where the White House issued Executive Order 14110, the Safe, Secure, and Trustworthy Development of Artificial Intelligence. And the White House in particular called on the independent agencies here, the Fair Housing Finance Agency and the CFPB, were encouraged to use their authorities to, where possible, to provide guidance on AI tools to ensure compliance with fair lending laws, but also clarifying where existing laws and regulations apply to AI. And the CFPB has touched upon this area in a few areas, particularly where there's the use of the requirements under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Credit Reporting Act to provide adverse action notices. And this is where a lender is required, a creditor is required to provide notice to the consumer when they either deny the consumer for credit or give the consumer credit on less favorable terms than other people. And the Bureau has been very clear with these adverse action notices. When you're using AI, you need to provide those notices as well. You're not given a pass because you're using some black box. You need to understand what the data that you're using and the AI that you're using. And if you can't understand it so that you can provide reasons to the consumer why they're being treated differently, you can't use the AI. So kudos to the Bureau for putting out that circular. The CFPB also put out a circular in 2023 saying you can't, as a creditor, you can't also just rely on a checklist. The Bureau and the other regulators have put out a list of reason codes that creditors can consider using as samples when they give these adverse action notices to consumers. But you can't just use these reasons in the sample form if they really don't apply and they're not accurate. You need to provide accurate information. And this goes to the issue of explainability. Creditors need to understand and be able to explain their use of AI and machine learning models so that they can explain to consumers why they've made their decisions. One important piece of guidance that came out verbally from the CFPB was from Patrice Ficklin speaking at the NCRC conference and a few other conferences afterwards last year. And Patrice made it very clear that creditors, when they're using AI, you can't just launch your use of an algorithm or a model and look at the data that's going into the model, the inputs, and say, okay, that's the end of my responsibility as the creditor. You need to rigorously monitor that model that you're using as you're using it to make sure that you're not having a discriminatory outcome. And you need to consider less discriminatory alternative approaches if your model, in fact, has some disparate impact. And that testing and updating of your model is critical to ensuring that you're fair lending compliant. Now, this set off some shockwaves in the industry last year, because it was the first time really that I think a regulator had been really clear that third part of the test for disparate impact really was on the lender. And it makes total sense because only the lender is in possession of the codes, the algorithms, the data. There's no way that an outside consumer, certainly, or even a law enforcement agency would have access to the data to be able to determine that there had been a responsible search for a less discriminatory alternative. And so this burden really has to be with the creditor as it's making these decisions using AI. Now, this guidance was verbal. And one of the things that I have been advocating for, as well as NAFA and other advocates, is that the Bureau could really come out with some written guidance, either in the form of a circular or a rule, or that would provide more information in terms of directionally, what are some approaches that the Bureau is seeing have promise, the metrics that could be used to determine whether a creditor was using the less discriminatory alternative, and other approaches that the Bureau feels that it needs to be more transparent about in terms of what it's seeing in the marketplace. The Bureau has provided some general guidance on the use of automated valuation models. These are the models that in lieu of an appraisal that you can put data into to determine an approach to determining the value of a house or an apartment or other housing that you're trying to determine the value for making a decision about whether to make the loan or not. The use of chatbots, which Lucine mentioned earlier. You can't just use a chatbot and have it make decisions and make exclusions as part of its dealings with the customer that are unfair or discriminatory. The CFPB has discussed abusiveness under UDAP. It's unfair, deceptive, and abusive practices. It includes AI, particularly AI in marketing products, in selecting who's going to get marketing and direct offers from creditors, for example, and has also discussed digital redlining and discriminatory algorithms at a very high level to say that existing laws apply. And there's this directive that the leadership of the CFPB has discussed, which is called there's no technological exceptionalism. Whether you're using a basic logistic regression model or AI or machine learning or an abacus, you have to make sure that you're meeting the fair lending laws. And that makes a lot of sense. But what I've been advocating for, again, and what Morgan and others have touched upon, is need some more concrete guidance, particularly because we're at this inflection point with the use of AI, where it's really permeating the market in terms of how decisions are made, even in the mortgage setting.
Sorry, Brad, we are at time.
Okay, so I'll just close here and say these are some resources that I would refer to that people consider. And these are, a couple of them are the same that Morgan mentioned, but some blogs that I've written, and I would steer people to that report from the Monitor and Upstart that Morgan had mentioned. That just came out last month. And it's an example of where, again, a company decided that the trade-off between accuracy and fairness, that they had trouble with that decision about whether to implement a less discriminatory alternative because they felt the performance of the model was being degraded by being more fair. And so I think this is another example of a company being put in this position of making a decision, and maybe guidance from the regulators would have helped resolve the issue. So thank you. I look forward to your questions. I'll turn it back to Jamil.
Thank you, Brad. Now we'll have a panel discussion headed by Miranda Bogan, who is the director at AI Governance Lab, Center for Democracy and Technology. Over to you, Miranda.
Thank you so much. And I think everyone from the panel can also come on camera as we chat together about the presentations today. We were just talking about the legal and policy implications of the findings of the study. So I'd love to start there, and then maybe we'll dive back into the method itself. But just, Morgan, you mentioned that the law, does point to the need to search for less discriminatory alternatives. but does the law create the right incentives to consider those alternatives at the right point in the development of machine learning models or AI models? Or is there something that might need to change to actually make sure that that developers are spending the necessary effort to take those actions earlier?
It's a great question, Miranda. In terms of the issue of the ability to apply consideration of less discriminatory alternatives, there's a real issue within the industry and the development and deployment of these technologies in the transparency of the technology that's at play. The models and the variables that are used in those models are all proprietary, and therefore the ability to really look into these systems and evaluate how they're aligning in terms of their operations and their outcomes, and really where the rubber meets the road in terms of how you might employ different approaches that could still meet your business justification. Really need to get into the models, and therefore it makes it really difficult at the front end to really ensure that there's this review. And so as a function of that, it really speaks to the need for enhanced regulatory oversight and engagement, because the regulators are positioned to be able to have that kind of influence on these kinds of underwriting and pricing models. But they haven't necessarily been at the table in pushing the guidance and the regulation to have the kind of standards in place to be able to implement these processes at the right time.
Great. And Brad, you said you've been advocating for this as well. I wonder if you can elaborate on what specific changes might need to be made, or what specific guidance could help clarify that this is the expectation.
Well, one quick answer would be, Kareem has discussed FairPlay's work, and there are multiple approaches that you could look at. And even if there is some trade-off, even if it's minor, between accuracy and fairness, perhaps the Bureau could speak to that it's okay to turn the dial a little bit towards fairness if you're losing a little bit of accuracy. And I know Kareem has argued that maybe you don't need to make that trade-off, but for those who aren't using the FairPlay method and there is a little bit of trade-off, the Bureau could speak to what is an appropriate trade-off to make to both comply with your safety and soundness requirements as a lender, but also your fairness requirements.
Yeah, I think that's such an important point, that question of what does it mean to be functionally as accurate? And, why are we assuming that the baseline is the true baseline? It's an unconstrained baseline, and might there be some sort of reasonable amount of change that might be required in order to make the model fair? So I wonder, Kareem, if you can go into a little bit more detail about in your findings, was it actually like equivalently as accurate, or how did you kind of define that? And is that necessary to kind of be at that exact bar? Or do you think, some band around a reasonable amount of accuracy is going to be important as we push for the search for less discriminatory alternatives?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think there's been a lot of consternation about this issue, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to address it. When we say functionally as accurate, we mean that less discriminatory alternatives should be able to achieve a performance level that's comparable to that of the incumbent model in a real world application. And let me just start by saying that the idea that a model developer knows ex ante the precise accuracy of their model outcomes is a canard. Right? Model performance is influenced by a variety of factors, like daily fluctuations in business activity, like lending policies, and the broader economic climate, right? So this inherent variability means that models have a predicted performance range, not a single fixed number. And our experience with LDAs over the 5+ years that we've been building them is that there can be multiple effective solutions for the same predictive problem, and that these models can achieve similar performance ranges within the expected business variability while also exhibiting significant differences in fairness. So in our study, we considered any less discriminatory alternative that matched the incumbent model's accuracy to the second decimal place to be functionally equivalent. And it's our view that deviations whatever happens out past the third variable place is typically so minor that it wouldn't have a material impact on business outcomes. So we believe it's really important to separate meaningful accuracy from what might be considered false precision, which are tiny differences with no real world consequence.
That's really insightful, and I think the type of detail that folks will be looking for. It sounded like, and I read this in the monitorship report that there was some disagreement over what sort of effort or cost was going to be acceptable for the sake of fairness. Morgan or Brad, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. And this gets to a bit of what Kareem is talking about. In brief, in regards to the application and analysis of this less discriminatory alternative, as the report details, Upstart measured the difference in accuracy between the baseline and alternative models directly, along with associated uncertainty in this difference, whereas the independent monitor measured the uncertainty of performance of the baseline model and then assessed if the alternative model's estimated performance is within the uncertainty interval of the baseline model. Those different approaches, manifest different conclusions about whether you should implement the less discriminatory alternative as a viable means of achieving your business justification of assessing a model for its accuracy. And so, again, it underscores the need for regulatory oversight in applying this. Ultimately, it may come down to enforcement and how the courts distinguish some of these standards, but the leadership of federal agencies would go a long way in moving us forward here.
And I would add that one thing that we shouldn't forget about is there are probably a lot of people on this call and in the industry who are listening to this discussion and saying, this sounds so complicated. How can I use AI and machine learning in a way that's going to advance inclusiveness? I may just stay off on the sidelines and not use this as a force for inclusion because it's murky. And so again, another reason for the regulators to provide some more guidance and leadership here is so that the mid-size and smaller creditors can use this technology to advance inclusion.
Absolutely. And we've been talking so far about the decision of like how to decide on model versions with regard to their overall kind of fairness characteristics and their performance characteristics. But in reality, when searching for less discriminatory alternatives, or even just looking at different versions of models, you would expect that you might see uneven improvement in fairness across different groups. Maybe one version has a dramatic increase in fairness for one group and a moderate one for another, whereas another has a equivalent increase, but that was lower than the best performing model for a certain group. How should practitioners navigate some of those complexities? I know we're trying to invite people to grapple with this, but these are the realities of engaging. How does one make decisions about which less discriminatory model to adopt if you've found maybe sort of different conclusions from a variety of different tests? And I'll turn that to anyone who'd like it.
I can comment on that a little bit since we're putting a paper out on this next week. First of all, let me just say, I think the Upstart Monitor got it right, which is to say, if you have an incumbent model that is accurate, but perhaps exhibits disparities, then, in theory, a less discriminatory alternative ought to be any other model that would perform within your risk tolerance and be fairer. But then the question then becomes, how confident do you have to be that that less discriminatory alternative will actually achieve your business objectives and also achieve the intended fairness outcomes? And so we think that, one way you might do this is to stress test the models, both of them, under, different operating conditions and under different applicant populations, and then literally just tally up how often is the less discriminatory model better, both in terms of its accuracy and its fairness, than the incumbent model. And if you do that for all of the LDAs, what you have then is a stable rank ordering of which LDA is most likely to achieve your business objective and your fairness objective. So now you still, that doesn't answer a very important question, which is, okay, well, where do you draw the confidence interval, right? So you can have, this would allow you to create a stable rank ordering of LDAs from best to least worst. But then there's a question that the Upstart Monitor also grappled with, which is, okay, well, how confident do you have to be that this LDA would perform within your risk tolerance? I think the Upstart Monitor suggested 68%, which I believe is like one standard deviation in terms of performance. That is the kind of question where I think as an industry and with folks in the policy community and with the regulators, it would be good for us to collectively come to some agreement, as has kind of been done informally around things like the 90% threshold for adverse impact ratio, et cetera.
Yeah, I think we can only hope that we'll be grappling with these more complicated conversations, because that means people are engaging in the work and actually searching for LDAs. I'd love to turn back to Kareem now, going back to the technical approach a little bit. You described the model pretty clearly, but just a refresher for folks who maybe got caught in the weeds of like a high level description, maybe an analogy of how does this method work, and how does it also differ from other types of fairness interventions? And is there a recommendation that people necessarily use this one, or it's a proof of concept that there are ways to get at less discriminatory alternatives without necessarily directly using demographic data at the point of decision?
Yeah. Well, I think there are, let me discuss kind of 3 algorithmic fairness approaches, and I'll try to discuss them as conceptually as I can, and maybe some of the pluses and minuses of each. So today we've been talking about distribution matching, and allow me to, if you will, to use an analogy. So imagine that like you're trying to train a dog to fetch a ball, and you want that dog to learn the right behavior, which is grab the ball and bring it back. We'll kind of define that as accuracy, right? Did you grab the ball and bring it back? Now, to achieve this, you can use a dog training technique with rewards and penalties. So like when the dog fetches the ball successfully, it gets a treat, a reward that signifies that it did well, right? It was accurate. If the dog chases squirrels, right, instead of the ball, that is to say, if the dog makes a mistake, it doesn't get a treat, right? It's effectively penalized by the withholding of a treat, which indicates to the dog that it needs to improve, right? Now, imagine you've got your dog doing a reasonable job fetching balls, but you discover that it's actually only fetching balls for people wearing red shirts, right? Well, the reward system we described above of penalties and rewards only focuses on whether a ball gets fetched, which is accuracy. It doesn't focus on, whose ball gets fetched. And so to deal with the problem of the dog only fetching balls for people in red shirts, we have to add a new element to our training process. We have to set a goal for the dog to fetch balls equally for people in red shirts and in blue shirts. And so if the dog fetches balls mostly for red shirts, it gets a penalty because it's not being fair to the blue shirt wearing people. And over time, the dog learns to fetch for everyone, regardless of what they look like. This kind of extra layer in the dog training process encourages the dog to both be accurate, which is to say to fetch balls, and fair, which is to say to fetch them for everyone. Another methodology that's commonly used in algorithmic fairness is called algorithmic debiasing. And in fact, my co-founder, John, I think arguably was maybe the first person to apply algorithmic fairness, algorithmic debiasing to consumer credit models 5+ years ago. And you can think of algorithmic debiasing as best explained through kind of cops and counterfeiters. So imagine you've got a team of skilled counterfeiters who are really good at making fake IDs, and their job is to create forgeries that are so convincing that they can fool the cops. The cops in this case represent an AI model trying to make accurate decisions, like trying to identify real IDs from fake IDs. And here's the twist, right? The cops learn from the counterfeiters. Every time a fake ID fools them, the cops get smarter at spotting the forgeries. And the counterfeiters, in turn, trying to make even more convincing fake IDs based on what fooled the cops earlier. And so this back and forth kind of helps the cops become much sharper at identifying the real IDs. And this also kind of works in credit underwriting. You can have a model that's attempting to predict who's going to default, and a model that's also trying to predict, is a given applicant Black, is a given applicant Hispanic? And to the extent that that adversary model is able to correctly identify who's Black and who's Hispanic, the predictive model, the cops, can adjust their decisioning process in ways that make that identification of protected status harder to discern. Both of these approaches require some consciousness of protected status during the model training process. And as we've been discussing, there are differing views about what the legitimate uses of protected status are in algorithmic fairness. So there is a technique that allows you to kind of build that efficient frontier of alternative credit models without using protected status. You can think about it as basically selecting subsets of variables to see if they're predictive of your risk target, but not predictive of protected status. And it turns out that if you select those subsets of the variables carefully, you can, in fact, achieve an efficient frontier without having used protected status. Let's talk about limitations of these techniques. So distribution matching has the benefit of being really fast, and it can rely on standard machine learning techniques. Adversarial debiasing is slow and unstable and is no longer the state of the art. Iterative feature subset selection, which is that method I described a moment ago that doesn't require protected status information, because it relies on a subset of variables, it may introduce some robustness and stability problems to your model, because now if one of those subsets, one of those variables from the subset is missing, then your model is going to be much more sensitive to that missingness than it might have been otherwise. So I think the key takeaway is there are increasingly good approaches for doing this stuff. They all have pluses and minuses. We like distribution matching, but regardless, there are now multiple techniques that allow lenders to identify fairer alternatives. And the key thing is you have to bother to look.
And I would add to what Kareem said is, going back to the metaphor of the dog fetching the ball is, modelers at these creditors have a lot of power in coming up with very creative approaches. And so if we're going to have the dog catch the ball and bring it back uniformly in a fair way, we need to have incentivize modelers to do the right thing. And so having some guardrails, some guidance about how many standard deviations should we look at here? What's the trade-off between fairness and accuracy? Is there a metric we should be looking at for less discriminatory alternatives or directional approaches that the regulators are seeing that they're comfortable with? That kind of information keeps the dog on track. It informs the compliance people and the lawyers at these lenders, fintechs or banks, to go to their modelers and say, look, we have some guidance here. We need to build that kind of fairness metric into the model. And that's why we're pushing so hard on some additional guidance here from the regulators.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful in kind of thinking through all the different approaches practitioners might adopt. We got a question from someone in the audience, Shirley, that we're talking about what regulators could do in the future, but what does enforcement look like right now? Have regulators kind of brought attention to this yet? Is that starting? How do we anticipate that playing out in the near future? Morgan, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, that both OCC and the CFPB have in their routine exam procedures enhanced their oversight of these operations. And one of the things that colleagues have called for in advancing discussions around this, short of issuing further regulation, is for these institutions to public reports on instances in which, in the course of these private, confidential regulatory exams and the unpacking of these less discriminatory alternatives, what reviews they've applied, what standards they've applied, and how that has manifest conclusions around the application of when and how to implement different less discriminatory alternatives. That could present case studies, which one would be, pretty safe in terms of any challenge, because it wouldn't be articulating new regulation. It would simply be providing public information about best practices. But at the same time, it would allow for the industry to understand how regulators are looking at these issues as we move forward.
And to echo what Morgan just said, I mean, this is something that Adam Rust and I wrote about for the Consumer Federation of America back in January, this approach of some more transparency from the regulators, including the Bureau, and what they're seeing in their supervisory exams that's working and is not working. This transparency would be very helpful. Now, that's not to say that the Bureau is not, and the other prudential regulators are not taking steps here. I mean, I know that they're examining banks and the use of AI. I suspect there are more enforcement actions coming, but there's going to be farther and further between. And on a daily basis, the regulators are seeing things in practice, and transparency would really help in terms of what they're seeing and watch outs for the industry.
Excellent. And, maybe to wrap up, we have 2 minutes left, and there's a couple more questions that came in from the audience about the research and the findings. If I'm not mistaken, that there's a written work product that folks can go and read more about the research and that some of the choices that were made in the modeling process. So definitely check that out. But maybe just as a last call to action, what would it look like for practitioners to kind of adopt these searches more proactively? What does it take? And, any last words on the, legal or policy front as well that folks want to add? I'll start with you, Kareem, on what does it take to do this?
Sure. Look, I think that the key takeaways here are LDAs actually done right present an opportunity for responsible growth. It is possible to identify LDAs that are profitable and fair, but you have to bother to look. As I think some of the folks have said on the call today, the regulators appear leaning towards, making you look. And I think that, another key takeaway is that the search for LDAs should probably take place at every high stakes part of the customer journey, from, marketing to fraud detection, to income verification, to underwriting, to, pricing, and heaven forbid, loss mitigation. I think one consequence of this is that compliance functions are going to need to modernize. The old way of doing kind of fair lending compliance, humans reviewing variables to identify facial bias and then waiting for a year to gauge disparities in outcomes, is probably insufficient in the era of AI and big data. So the lenders and landlords and other users of predictive models to make decisions affecting consumers need something more closely resembling kind of 24/7, 365 visibility into the fairness outcomes of their decisions.
And one of the resources that Morgan and I both included in our presentations was FinReg Lab, this nonpartisan think tank that's out there. It's done a lot of research on different techniques, but you can see what different players are using in the industry. It's very helpful to look at their research.
Agreed. Great research by them. Great research by NAFA and FairPlay, and thanks to everyone for jumping on this webinar. Really interesting stuff, and hopefully we can make some progress on this issue in the future. NAFA folks, any last words?
Thank you, Miranda, for your assistance with the facilitation today. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you all the panelists and speakers for their valuable time and insights. And thank you for all the attendees for your valuable time. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.